A millionaire catches his wife with their maid late one evening, sharing an intimate conversation. He says nothing, but what he learns that night leaves him stunned. Secrets unravel, hearts are tested, and one decision will change their lives forever. Why did he stay silent? And what happens next? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Edward Benson stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, his reflection ghosting against the city lights spread out 40 stories below. His fingers traced the cool glass as his mind wandered back to where it all began. A cramped apartment with second-hand furniture and a computer that crashed more often than it worked. The skyline before him had changed dramatically in the 20 years since he'd written his first line of code. Back then, he'd been living on instant noodles and coffee, dreaming of creating games that would change the world. Now, at 45, he was the CEO of Benson Gaming, one of the largest gaming companies in the world. His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Mr. Benson, the quarterly reports are ready for your review." Edward turned from the window and settled behind his massive mahogany desk. The numbers on the screen made him smile. Another record-breaking quarter. Revenue had doubled since last year, and their latest game launch had broken all previous records. The memory of that first big break flooded back. He'd been working out of his garage then, with 3 employees who believed in his vision enough to work for practically nothing. The day they'd secured their first major investor, they'd celebrated with cheap champagne and plastic cups. His phone buzzed with a message from Susan. "Don't forget about dinner tonight." Edward's stomach tightened. He'd completely forgotten about their dinner plans. His fingers hovered over the phone as he composed a reply. "Sorry, caught up in quarterly review. Rain check." Her response was quick and familiar. "Of course. Don't work too late." 3 short sentences that said so much more. He could feel the resignation in her words, the same way he felt it in her smile when he left for work each morning. Later that evening, Edward sat at the head of a long table in an exclusive restaurant surrounded by board members and investors. Crystal glasses clinked as someone proposed a toast to their success. "To Edward Benson, the man who turned a garage startup into an empire." The praise washed over him like lukewarm water. His eyes drifted to the empty chair beside him, Susan's usual place at these events. She'd stopped attending months ago, saying she felt out of place among the business talk and forced laughter. The evening dragged on with discussions of market shares and future projections. Edward nodded at appropriate moments, signed the contracts that needed signing, and shook the hands that needed shaking. Oh, but his mind kept wandering to the early days when success meant having enough money to take Susan out for a real dinner, not these elaborate business functions. It was past midnight when his driver pulled up to their mansion in the hills. The house loomed before him, all stone and glass and carefully manicured gardens. Every light was off except the porch lights Susan always left on for him. Edward's footsteps echoed through the marble foyer. The house felt more like a museum than a home, perfect and pristine, but cold. He loosened his tie and walked past the living room where Susan used to wait up for him, reading or watching TV. Now the room sat empty, the furniture barely used. Upstairs, he paused outside their bedroom door. Through the crack, he could see Susan's sleeping form, her back turned to his side of the bed. The distance between them seemed far greater than the few feet of expensive mattress that separated them. Susan stood in the meticulously landscaped garden, scattering birdseed across the stone pathway. A group of sparrows hopped nearby, their tiny feet dancing across the perfectly trimmed grass. The morning sun cast long shadows through the wrought iron fence that surrounded the property. Beautiful, but somehow prison-like in its ornate design. "At least you can fly away whenever you want," she murmured to a particularly bold sparrow that ventured close to her feet. The bird cocked its head, then quickly snatched a seed before retreating. The massive house loomed behind her, its windows gleaming like distant eyes. Susan remembered when they'd first moved in 5 years ago. Edward had been so proud, calling it their dream home. Now it felt more like an elegant tomb, filled with expensive furniture that rarely felt the warmth of human touch. Inside, the kitchen staff was preparing lunch. Susan barely touched her plate, pushing the perfectly arranged food around while checking her phone. No messages from Edward. She dialed his number, listening to it ring several times before his assistant answered. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Benson. Mr. Benson is in a board meeting. Would you like me to have him call you back?" "No, that's fine," Susan replied, knowing from experience that the return call would never come. "Just let him know I called." The afternoon stretched before her like an endless road. Susan wandered through the house, her footsteps echoing off marble floors. In the library, she paused before a photo from their early marriage. Edward and her at a small apartment party, both laughing as they attempted to cook dinner for their friends. His eyes had been so bright then, focused entirely on her instead of spreadsheets and business meetings. James, their butler, appeared silently at her elbow. "Will Mr. Benson be joining you for dinner this evening, madam?" "No, James. He has a late meeting." The words felt rehearsed, having been spoken so many times before. "Very well. Shall I have the kitchen prepare something light for you?" Susan nodded, barely registering the conversation. The staff moved through the house like well-orchestrated shadows. James, with his perfect posture and diplomatic smile, the groundskeeper who maintained the gardens with military precision, and Paula, the young maid who seemed to be the only one who actually met Susan's eyes when speaking. As evening settled over the mansion, Susan found herself in the conservatory, surrounded by exotic plants that required constant attention from the gardeners. The silence pressed in around her, broken only by the gentle whir of climate control systems. She heard soft footsteps and turned to see Paula collecting empty teacups from earlier in the day. Unlike the other staff members, Paula didn't immediately try to make herself invisible. "Would you like fresh tea, Mrs. Benson?" Paula asked, her voice carrying a warmth that had become rare in this house. "Actually," Susan said, surprising herself, "would you like to join me for some?" She saw the momentary hesitation in Paula's eyes. "Please, this room feels too big for just one person." Paula's smile was genuine as she set down her cleaning supplies. "I'd like that very much, Mrs. Benson." "Susan," she corrected gently. "Please, call me Susan." The kitchen's warm glow created a cozy atmosphere as Susan and Paula sat at the small service table, their teacups steaming between them. It was becoming their nightly ritual, a stark difference from the formal dining room where Susan usually ate alone, surrounded by empty chairs and echoing silence. "The jasmine tea is lovely," Paula said, wrapping her hands around the delicate cup. Her work uniform was still crisp, but her posture had relaxed, showing a comfort that hadn't been there in their earlier encounters. "It's my favorite," Susan replied, watching as Paula took another sip. "My grandmother used to make it this way, with just a touch of honey." As the evening progressed, their conversation flowed naturally. Paula shared stories about growing up in a small town, her voice growing animated as she described her mother's garden and the weekend farmers markets. "We didn't have much," Paula admitted, "but there was always love and laughter in our house." She paused, her expression clouding slightly. "Things changed after I got married, though." Susan leaned forward, noting the shift in Paula's tone. "How so?" Paula's fingers tightened around her cup. "Marriage isn't always what you expect it to be, is it?" The question hung in the air, heavy with shared understanding. Over the next few evenings, their conversations grew deeper. Paula gradually revealed more about her life, and Susan found herself sharing her own struggles, the loneliness of her massive house, the growing distance with Edward. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm being ungrateful," Susan confessed one evening. "I have everything anyone could want, materially speaking." "Feelings aren't about what you own," Paula responded softly. "They're about connection." During one of their tea sessions, Paula seemed particularly troubled. After gentle prompting from Susan, she opened up about her husband's controlling behavior and mounting debts. "He wants me to quit my job," Paula said, her voice trembling. "Says it's beneath us, that he can provide everything. But I know it's because he wants me isolated." Susan reached across the table, covering Paula's hand with her own. "You don't have to make any decisions right now, but please know you have options. I can help you find resources, people who specialize in these situations." Paula's eyes welled with tears. "Thank you. Just having someone listen, it means more than you know." As they finished their tea that evening, Susan felt a warmth in her chest she hadn't experienced in years. The simple act of connecting with another person, of sharing fears and hopes over steaming cups of tea, had brought life back into the cold mansion. Yet beneath the contentment lurked a subtle guilt. Shouldn't she be sharing these intimate conversations with Edward instead of finding solace in friendship with her maid? Paula gathered their cups, returning to her role as staff member. But the gentle smile they shared spoke of something deeper than employer and employee. Their evening conversations had become a lifeline for both women, filling an emptiness neither had fully acknowledged before. The conservatory glowed with the last rays of sunset filtering through its glass panels. Susan sat in her favorite wicker chair while Paula moved between the potted plants, checking their soil and removing yellowed leaves. Steam rose from their usual teacups, placed on a small table between them. "These orchids are doing so well now," Paula said, gently touching a pristine white bloom. "They just needed a little extra care and attention." Susan watched as Paula tenderly misted the flowers. "You have such a way with them. I could never keep them alive before you came." "It's like people, really," Paula replied, settling into the chair opposite Susan. "Sometimes they just need someone to notice when they're struggling." Their laughter echoed through the glass-enclosed space as Paula recounted a story from her childhood, about the time she'd accidentally let her mother's prize chickens loose during a county fair. "And there I was," Paula said, wiping tears of mirth from her eyes, "chasing these chickens all over the fairground in my Sunday best. My mother was mortified, but my father couldn't stop laughing." Unknown to both women, Edward had returned home earlier than usual. He stood in the shadows of the hallway, drawn by the sound of unfamiliar laughter in his house. Through the conservatory's glass walls, he watched the scene unfold, struck by how animated Susan appeared, a stark contrast to her usual reserved demeanor around him. "I miss this," Susan said softly, her laughter fading. "Just having someone to talk to share things with." She traced the rim of her teacup with her finger. "Edward's barely home anymore. When he is, he's distant, preoccupied." Edward's chest tightened at her words. He remained motionless in the hallway, listening. "I understand what it's like," Paula responded gently. "When my husband first started changing, I felt so alone. But having someone who listens, it makes such a difference." "You've been such a blessing, Paula," Susan said, reaching out to squeeze her hand. "I don't know what I'd do without our evening talks." Edward watched the genuine affection between the two women, his emotions conflicted. Part of him felt relief. Susan wasn't completely alone in this big house after all. But another part felt unsettled by their closeness, by the easy intimacy they shared that he and Susan had lost somewhere along the way. He stepped back quietly, his mind churning with what he'd witnessed. The sound of their continued conversation followed him down the hallway as he retreated to his study, deciding to keep his early arrival and his observations to himself for now. The soft glow of Edward's desk lamp illuminated the photograph in his hands. Behind him, floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the city's twinkling lights, but his attention remained fixed on the image. Him and Susan on their honeymoon, both laughing as they shared an ice cream cone at the beach. Her eyes sparkled with joy, and his arm was wrapped protectively around her shoulders. He ran his thumb over the silver frame. "Where did we lose that?" he whispered to himself. The buzz of his phone interrupted his thoughts. Another business call, another deadline. He placed the photo back on his desk, facing it slightly away from him. During a break at his conference the next day, Edward found himself dialing Susan's number. The connection crackled slightly before her voice came through. "Hello? Susan, it's me. Just checking in." "Oh, Edward, how's the conference?" "Good, busy. You sound tired. Everything okay?" Susan paused before answering. "Just the usual. The house is quiet." "Well, get some rest. I should be home in a few days." Edward missed the slight tremor in her voice, the unspoken plea for more than just small talk. "Of course. Take care," she replied softly. Later that evening, Susan stood alone at the annual charity gala, a champagne flute in her hand. The ballroom buzzed with conversation and laughter, but she felt oddly disconnected from it all. Her mind drifted to similar events years ago, when Edward would keep his hand at the small of her back, when they'd share secret smiles across crowded rooms. "Susan! Earth to Susan!" Margaret Taylor, her friend of 20 years, waved a hand in front of her face. "Sorry, Meg. I was just..." Thinking about Edward. Margaret's expression softened with understanding. "When's the last time you two actually spent an evening together?" Susan swirled the champagne in her glass. "I can't remember. He's always working, always building his empire." She blinked back unexpected tears. "Sometimes I wonder if he remembers I'm here at all." "Have you told him how you feel?" "How can I? He's achieved so much. Who am I to complain when we have everything we could want?" Susan gestured at her designer dress, the expensive jewelry adorning her neck. "Everything except each other," Margaret said gently. The drive home felt longer than usual. Susan watched the streetlights blur past her window as her driver navigated the quiet streets. When they pulled up to the mansion, she thanked him and walked slowly to the front door. Inside, her heels clicked against the marble floor, echoing in the vast emptiness. She passed the living room with its perfectly arranged furniture, the dining room with its massive table where she ate alone, the kitchen where only Paula's company brought any warmth. Standing in their bedroom, Susan ran her hand over Edward's side of the bed, cold and untouched for days. The room was filled with luxury, silk curtains, antique furniture, priceless art on the walls, but none of it could fill the space where her husband's presence should be. The wheels of Edward's private jet touched down on the rain-slicked runway 3 days ahead of schedule. Through the small window, he watched the city lights glimmer in the early evening darkness. The cancellation of his final meetings had been unexpected, but as he thought of Susan, a smile tugged at his lips. Maybe this was a chance to make up for lost time. Instead of calling his usual driver, Edward hailed a taxi outside the airport. The casual normalcy of it reminded him of his early days, before the success, before the empire. He watched the familiar streets pass by, remembering drives with Susan when they were newlyweds. Her hand clasped in his. "Big place," the taxi driver whistled as they pulled up to the mansion's gates. Edward nodded, paid, and gathered his small overnight bag. Rather than using the grand front entrance, he made his way around to the back of the house. The garden path was lit by soft landscape lighting, and the wet grass sparkled. He pulled out his keys, carefully opening the kitchen door. The house was quiet, but not entirely silent. Somewhere, he could hear voices, the gentle murmur of conversation punctuated by occasional laughter. Edward set his bag down and followed the sound, his expensive shoes silent on the marble floors. The voices grew clearer as he approached the conservatory. The glass-walled room glowed warmly in the evening darkness, filled with Susan's carefully tended plants. Edward reached for the door handle, but stopped short at what he saw through the glass. Susan sat on the small ivory sofa, closer to Paula than he'd ever seen her sit with anyone in recent years. Their heads were bent together in intimate conversation, teacups forgotten on the small table before them. Paula's shoulders shook slightly, and Edward realized she was crying. "You don't have to go back to him," Susan was saying, her voice clear even through the glass. "You deserve so much better than that, Paula. No one should live in fear of their own husband." Edward watched, frozen, as his wife reached out and took Paula's hands in hers. The gesture was so natural, so full of comfort and understanding. Paula's tears fell faster, and Susan pulled her into a tight embrace, holding her as she cried. "We'll figure something out," Susan whispered, stroking Paula's hair like a mother comforting a child. "You're not alone anymore. I promise." Edward stood in the shadows, watching this intimate scene unfold. He'd never seen this side of Susan, or rather he realized with a pang. He hadn't seen it in years. The tenderness in her eyes, the gentle strength in her voice, the way she held Paula with such care. It was all so familiar, and yet so foreign to their current relationship. The two women held each other, their silhouettes framed by the conservatory's glass walls and the lush greenery surrounding them. Edward remained still, an outsider looking in on a moment of pure connection and understanding that made his chest ache with something he couldn't quite name. Edward's heart pounded as he watched the intimate scene before him. The way Susan held Paula, stroking her hair and whispering words of comfort, stirred something dark and uncomfortable in his chest. He couldn't remember the last time Susan had shown him such tenderness, such care. His fingers tightened around the door handle. He hadn't realized he was still gripping. The closeness between the two women seemed to mock him, highlighting the growing distance in his own marriage. Susan's gentle touches, her soft words, the way she leaned in close to Paula. It all felt wrong somehow, like watching someone else living the life he should have had with his wife. "It's okay," Susan murmured to Paula. "You're safe here." Edward's jaw clenched. Safe here? What did that mean? His mind raced with possibilities, each one making him feel more confused and upset than the last. The tenderness in Susan's voice was something he hadn't heard in years, not since the early days of their marriage when they would stay up late talking about their dreams. Paula wiped her eyes, and Susan handed her a tissue from a box on the small table. Their hands brushed, lingering for a moment that made Edward's stomach twist. He watched as Susan squeezed Paula's hand, offering a warm smile that used to be reserved for him. The jealousy rising in his chest felt irrational, but he couldn't push it away. How had he not noticed this relationship developing under his own roof? When had Susan started finding such intimate companionship with someone else while he buried himself in work? His own guilt mixed with the jealousy, creating a confusing cocktail of emotions. He thought of all the dinner dates he'd canceled, the weekends he'd spent at the office, the countless times he'd chosen his empire over his wife. Had he driven her to seek connection elsewhere? Unable to watch any longer, Edward stepped back from the door. His head was spinning with questions he wasn't ready to face. The weight of his briefcase felt suddenly heavy in his hand, and his tie seemed to constrict around his throat. Quietly, careful not to make a sound, he retreated down the hallway toward his study. Each step felt mechanical, automatic, as his mind replayed the scene he'd just witnessed. The image of Susan's tender expression, so foreign to him now but so freely given to Paula, burned in his thoughts. His study had always been his sanctuary, a place where everything made sense. But as he closed the heavy wooden door behind him, even this familiar space felt different. The awards and accolades on the walls seemed to mock him, trophies of success that had cost him something far more precious. Edward sank into his leather chair, loosening his tie with trembling fingers. The darkness of the room matched his troubled thoughts as he tried to make sense of what he'd seen. His wife, his Susan, sharing such an intimate moment with someone else. It felt like a betrayal, even though he knew somewhere deep down that he had no right to feel betrayed. The darkness of Edward's study matched the growing shadows in his mind. He poured himself a drink with shaking hands, the crystal decanter clinking against the glass. The scene he had witnessed in the conservatory played over and over in his thoughts, like a movie he couldn't stop watching. His initial surge of jealousy began to fade, replaced by a gnawing sense of shame. Who was he to feel betrayed? The weight of his own past indiscretions pressed down on him like a physical burden. Images of hotel rooms and hushed phone calls flashed through his memory, each one a knife of guilt twisting deeper. "I have no right," he whispered to the empty room. The whiskey burned his throat, but it couldn't wash away the bitter taste of hypocrisy. Edward loosened his tie further and slumped in his chair. How many nights had Susan spent alone while he worked late at the office? How many business trips had actually been rendezvous with other women? The expensive jewelry he'd bought to ease his conscience sat in Susan's drawer, probably untouched. She had always preferred simpler things. The sound of distant laughter drifted through the walls, Susan's voice mixing with Paula's. Edward closed his eyes, remembering when Susan used to laugh like that with him. Back when they would spend Sunday mornings in bed, sharing coffee and dreams. Before the gaming empire, before the success, before he'd convinced himself that his ambitions justified everything else. His hand tightened around the glass. The urge to storm into the conservatory and demand answers bubbled up inside him, but he knew he had no moral ground to stand on. What would he say? How could he question Susan's relationship with Paula without exposing his own betrayals? The irony wasn't lost on him. While he had sought physical comfort in meaningless affairs, Susan had found emotional intimacy in friendship. She hadn't left, hadn't cheated. She had simply found someone who would listen, who would be there, someone who filled the void he had created. Edward stood up and walked to the window, watching the sunset behind the city skyline he had conquered. His empire stretched across those buildings, but standing here now, it felt hollow. He had built something massive and impressive, but at what cost? The distance between him and Susan had grown with each floor added to his corporate tower. The reflection in the window showed him a man he barely recognized, successful, wealthy, and completely alone. Susan deserved better. She deserved the man she had married, the one who used to bring her wildflowers and write silly notes on the bathroom mirror. Setting down his glass, Edward made a decision. He wouldn't confront Susan about what he'd seen. Instead, he would focus on rebuilding what he had broken. It was time to close the distance he had created, to prove he could be the husband she deserved. The path to redemption wouldn't be easy, but it had to start somewhere. Edward sat in his dimly lit home office, a box of old photographs spread across his mahogany desk. His fingers traced the edge of a particular image. Susan, in a yellow sundress, laughing as he twirled her at their wedding reception. The joy in her eyes pierced his heart. He pulled out another photograph, this one from their 5th anniversary. Susan sat alone at a restaurant table, a forced smile on her face. He remembered that night. He had arrived 2 hours late due to an emergency board meeting. In truth, he had been with someone else. The weight of his choices pressed down on his shoulders as he sifted through more memories captured on paper. Susan at charity events, always standing slightly apart from the crowd. Susan in their garden, tending to her roses, with a solitude that now seemed less peaceful and more lonely. "What have I done?" he muttered, running a hand through his graying hair. His eyes fell on a stack of credit card statements. Designer handbags, diamond necklaces, exotic vacations. All his attempts to buy forgiveness without actually earning it. Susan had accepted each gift with quiet grace, but he now realized she would have preferred his presence over presents. A business award caught his attention, gleaming on the shelf. The night he received it, Susan had planned a special dinner to celebrate their anniversary. He had completely forgotten, caught up in the excitement of his success. He remembered her voice on the phone, soft and resigned, saying she understood. More photographs spilled across his desk. Their early years together, when success was just a dream and love was enough. Back then, he had rushed home every evening, eager to share his day with her. Now, he couldn't remember the last time they had a real conversation. The image of Susan and Paula's embrace in the conservatory flashed through his mind. The tenderness he had witnessed wasn't romantic. It was the simple human connection he had denied his wife for years. While he had sought physical comfort in meaningless affairs, Susan had found emotional support in friendship. Edward gathered the photographs, each one a testament to his failures as a husband. The successful gaming empire he had built seemed to mock him now. He had conquered markets and created virtual worlds, while his real world, his marriage, had crumbled around him. His annual planner lay open on the desk, pages filled with meetings, conferences, and business dinners. With determined movements, he began marking out blocks of time. Susan deserved more than the leftover moments of his day. She deserved the man who had once promised to put her first, who had meant every word of their wedding vows. The clock on the wall ticked steadily as Edward confronted years of neglect and betrayal. Each photograph, each memory added to his resolve. He couldn't change the past, but he could choose a different path forward. It was time to prove that his love for Susan was worth more than all the success in the world. Edward spent the morning making arrangements, his fingers drumming nervously on his desk as he called Susan's favorite restaurant, the Coastal Pearl. The maitre d' recognized his name immediately, but Edward insisted on a specific table, the one by the window where they had celebrated their 1st anniversary. "And could you arrange for fresh peonies?" he asked, remembering how Susan's eyes had lit up at their scent during their courtship. Pink ones, if possible. Later that afternoon, Edward stood in their bedroom, changing his tie for the 3rd time. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the Windsor knot. When Susan walked in, wearing a simple blue dress that brought out the warmth in her eyes, his breath caught in his throat. "You look beautiful," he said softly. Susan's surprise showed in her slight hesitation. "Thank you, Edward. You mentioned dinner, but you didn't say where." The drive to the Coastal Pearl was quiet at first, but Edward made an effort to break the silence. "How have your garden renovations been going?" he asked, genuinely interested in the project she had mentioned in passing weeks ago. Susan's eyes widened slightly at his remembrance. "The roses are coming along nicely," she said, her voice warming as she described the new varieties she had planted. At the restaurant, Edward pulled out Susan's chair. noting how she smiled at the peonies on their table. As they settled in, he consciously put his phone away, facing it down and switching it to silent mode. "Tell me more about your days," Edward said as they started their appetizers. "I've been so caught up in work. I feel like I've missed so much." Susan paused, her fork halfway to her mouth. "My days," she repeated, as if testing the words. Slowly, she began to share stories about her volunteer work at the local library, her book club meetings, and her gardening projects. Edward listened intently, asking questions that showed he was truly engaged. When she mentioned a historical village she'd read about in Maine, his eyes lit up. "We should go there," he said suddenly. "Next weekend. You've always wanted to visit New England in the fall." "Really?" Susan's voice held a mixture of hope and hesitation. "But what about your meetings?" "They can wait," Edward said firmly. "This is more important." As their dinner progressed, Edward noticed Susan's shoulders relaxing, her smiles coming more freely. They shared memories of their early days together, laughing about their first apartment's temperamental heating system and the time they got lost on a road trip. After dinner, they walked along the moonlit beach near the restaurant. The sound of waves provided a gentle backdrop to their conversation. Susan wrapped her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, and Edward instinctively moved closer to shield her from the breeze. "Do you remember our first walk here?" Susan asked, her feet leaving delicate prints in the sand. "How could I forget? You were wearing that red sundress, and we talked until sunrise," Edward replied, the memory vivid in his mind. They continued their stroll, their conversation flowing more naturally than it had in years. Each step seemed to bridge a little more of the distance that had grown between them. Edward sat at his desk early Monday morning, his computer screen displaying his packed calendar for the upcoming weeks. With determined clicks, he began reshuffling appointments and conferences. His finger hovered over a major business meeting scheduled for their planned getaway weekend. "Mr. Benson," his assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, "the board is expecting you at the Tokyo merger discussion next weekend." "Cancel it," Edward said firmly. "Family emergency." The words felt right as they left his mouth. This was an emergency, just not the kind his colleagues would understand. 3 days later, Edward and Susan arrived at the Ocean View Inn, a charming bed and breakfast in coastal Maine, where they had spent their first anniversary. The familiar salt air greeted them as they stepped out of the car. Susan's eyes sparkled as she took in the white clapboard building with its blue shutters, unchanged after all these years. "They've maintained the gardens beautifully," she remarked, touching a hydrangea bloom. Edward watched her face light up, remembering how she used to photograph every flower they encountered on their early travels. During their first afternoon, Edward's phone buzzed repeatedly with urgent messages. Without hesitation, he switched it off and slipped it into the hotel room safe. Susan noticed the gesture, her expression softening. They spent hours exploring the town's winding streets, their shoulders brushing as they walked. At the Silver Shell Gallery, they found themselves in front of a familiar painting, a seascape they had admired years ago, but couldn't afford then. "It's still here," Susan whispered, her hand finding Edward's. That evening, they dined at Marina's, a small restaurant perched on the cliffs. Candlelight danced across their table as waves crashed below. Edward noticed how Susan's laugh came easier now, her stories flowing freely as she shared thoughts about her garden plans and her hopes for the community center she volunteered at. "I've missed this," she admitted, twirling her wine glass. "Just us." Edward reached across the table, taking her hand. "I've been buried in work for too long. I forgot what matters most." As the sun began its descent, they made their way to the beach. The sky painted itself in brilliant oranges and pinks, reflecting off the water. They found a weathered wooden bench, the same one where they had shared dreams and plans 2 decades ago. Susan leaned slightly against Edward's shoulder, their fingers intertwined. The familiar weight of her hand in his felt right, like coming home after a long journey. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun melt into the horizon, the moment holding all the promise of their renewed connection. Edward shifted uncomfortably in the leather armchair, facing Dr. Marshall's calm, attentive gaze. The counselor's office, with its soft lighting and muted colors, felt worlds away from his corporate boardroom. "I keep thinking about all the times I wasn't there," Edward said, his voice quieter than usual. "Birthday dinners, anniversaries, simple everyday moments. I traded them all for business meetings and international flights." Dr. Marshall nodded encouragingly. "And how does that make you feel now?" "Ashamed," Edward admitted, the word catching in his throat. "I tried to convince myself that providing a comfortable life was enough, but while I was chasing success, I was losing Susan bit by bit." The counselor leaned forward slightly. "Let's talk about the infidelity, Edward. What do you think drove those choices?" Edward's hands tightened on the armrest. "I told myself it was stress relief, that it didn't mean anything. But looking back, I think I was running from my own inadequacies. Every time the company grew, the pressure increased. Instead of sharing that burden with Susan, I looked for easy escapes." Dr. Marshall guided Edward through an exercise, asking him to close his eyes and imagine Susan's perspective during those years. The weight of realization settled heavy in Edward's chest as he pictured her waiting alone at restaurants, making excuses at social gatherings, falling asleep in an empty bed. "What I'm hearing," Dr. Marshall said, "is that you're beginning to understand the emotional impact of your choices. Let's work on some communication techniques that might help you express these feelings to Susan." They practiced different approaches, using "I feel" statements, active listening skills, and ways to show vulnerability without becoming defensive. Edward took notes, something he hadn't done since his college days. "Remember," Dr. Marshall emphasized, "healing takes time. You're not just trying to fix past mistakes, you're learning to be present and emotionally available now." As the session drew to a close, Edward felt both drained and lighter. The tools and insights he'd gained seemed like the first real steps toward meaningful change. He understood now that his journey wasn't just about making amends. It was about becoming the partner Susan had always deserved. Standing up to leave, Edward picked up his jacket, feeling a new sense of purpose. The path ahead would be challenging, but for the first time, he felt equipped to face it with honesty and emotional courage. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the garden as Susan and Paula worked together among the rose bushes. Their pruning shears made soft snipping sounds as they carefully shaped the flowering plants. Their movements synchronized after months of sharing this peaceful ritual. "These yellow ones are coming in beautifully," Paula said, gently touching a delicate bloom. Her voice carried a hint of strain that Susan had learned to recognize over their many conversations. Susan set down her tools and turned to her friend. "Something's troubling you today, isn't it?" Paula's hands trembled slightly as she lowered her shears. "My husband," she began, then paused to steady her voice. "Things haven't been good at home. Last night he came home angry again." Susan's heart ached at the fear she heard in Paula's words. She reached out and squeezed her friend's hand. "You can tell me anything, you know that." Tears welled in Paula's eyes as she continued. "He lost money gambling again. When I suggested he get help, he—" She touched her arm unconsciously, and Susan noticed her wince. "Oh, Paula," Susan whispered, moving closer to offer comfort. The roses forgotten. They sat together on the garden bench. "I don't know what to do," Paula confessed. "My family back home depends on the money I send. I can't just leave." Susan felt the familiar mix of emotions she'd experienced lately: deep concern for Paula, gratitude for their friendship, and a twinge of guilt about keeping their close relationship from Edward. "You don't have to face this alone," she assured Paula. "There are people who can help, organizations that support women in your situation." As they talked through possibilities and resources, Susan realized how much their relationship had evolved. What started as casual conversation had grown into a profound connection that filled the loneliness she'd experienced during Edward's absent years. Paula wiped her eyes and managed a small smile. "You're the first person who's ever really listened to me, Mrs. Benson." "Please, it's just Susan when we're together like this," Susan reminded her gently. "And listening is what friends do." They returned to tending the roses, working in comfortable silence punctuated by quiet conversation. Paula shared more details about her situation, and Susan offered what comfort and advice she could, drawing from her own experiences with marriage difficulties. As the sun began to set, casting an orange glow across the garden, Susan felt the familiar conflict rise in her heart. While Edward had been making genuine efforts to reconnect lately, she couldn't deny how much she'd come to depend on these moments with Paula. Their friendship had become a source of strength and joy during her loneliest times. Yet she wondered if maintaining such a close bond with an employee crossed some invisible line. They gathered their gardening tools as the daylight faded, their shared confidences hanging in the air between them. Paula's grateful smile reminded Susan of why she couldn't bring herself to create more distance between them, despite her uncertainties. This connection, complicated as it might be, had become precious to them both. Edward stood in the dining room, adjusting the placement of the wine glasses one last time. The soft glow from the chandelier created warm shadows across the carefully arranged table setting. He had chosen Susan's favorite flowers, white lilies for the centerpiece, and their subtle fragrance filled the air. His hands trembled slightly as he lit the candles. The past few weeks of counseling had given him the courage to face this moment, but his heart still raced at the thought of the conversation ahead. He touched the small notebook in his pocket where he had written key points he wanted to discuss: his observations of Susan's loneliness, his own infidelities, and his genuine desire to rebuild their relationship. "Just be honest," he whispered to himself, remembering his counselor's advice. "Start with acknowledging your own faults." The kitchen timer chimed softly, and Edward hurried to check on the salmon, Susan's favorite dish that he'd learned to prepare during their early marriage. The familiar routine of cooking helped steady his nerves. He'd deliberately chosen to make dinner himself rather than having their usual chef prepare it, wanting the evening to feel more personal and intimate. As he plated the food, Edward rehearsed his opening words again. "Susan, I need to tell you something important. These past months have helped me see things more clearly." He shook his head, starting over. "Susan, I love you, and I need to be honest about some things that have been weighing on my mind." The sound of Susan's car pulling into the driveway made his heart skip. Edward quickly lit the remaining candles and adjusted his tie. He wanted everything to be perfect for this difficult but necessary conversation. Through the window, he watched her walk toward the house, her elegant figure silhouetted against the setting sun. The sight reminded him of their first date, and his chest tightened with emotion. Despite all his mistakes, despite the distance that had grown between them, his love for her remained constant, perhaps stronger now that he understood its true value. Edward heard the front door open and Susan's footsteps in the hallway. He took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and moved to greet her. This conversation would be challenging, but it was essential for their future together. "Edward?" Susan called out, surprise evident in her voice as she caught the scent of dinner and spotted the dining room lights. "In here," he responded, his voice steady despite his nerves. As she entered the room, her eyes widened at the intimate setup. "What's all this?" she asked, a small smile playing at her lips. Edward pulled out her chair, gesturing for her to sit. "I thought we could have dinner together. There are some things I'd like to talk about." Susan's expression shifted slightly, showing curiosity mixed with concern as she took her seat. Edward poured them each a glass of wine, his counselor's words echoing in his mind about creating a safe space for vulnerable conversations. Just as he opened his mouth to begin the careful speech he'd prepared, the sharp ring of the doorbell cut through the intimate atmosphere. Edward hurried to the front door, irritation flickering across his face at the interruption. When he opened it, the sharp smell of alcohol hit him before he could even process the sight before him. A disheveled man with bloodshot eyes swayed unsteadily on their doorstep. "Where's my wife?" the man slurred, trying to push past Edward into the house. "I know she's here." Edward blocked the entrance, his body tensing. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." "Not without Paula." The man's voice rose to a shout. "And that woman who's been filling her head with ideas." Susan appeared in the hallway behind Edward, drawn by the commotion. The drunk man's eyes locked onto her, and his face contorted with rage. "You!" He jabbed a finger toward Susan. "You're the one who's been poisoning my Paula against me, telling her she deserves better." Susan's face paled. "Mr. Martinez, please. You're drunk. Let's talk about this when you're—" "Talk. That's all you do, isn't it?" He lunged forward, causing Edward to brace against the doorframe. "Talking to my wife, making her think she's too good for me. She won't even come home anymore because of you." Edward's protective instinct kicked in as he positioned himself more firmly between the drunk man and Susan. "That's enough. Leave now, or I'm calling the police." "You rich people think you can fix everything." Mr. Martinez's voice cracked with emotion. "Think you can just sweep in and destroy other people's marriages, acting all high and mighty in your mansion." Susan stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Nobody's destroying anything. Paula just needed—" "Needed what?" he spat. "A friend who fills her head with fancy ideas? Who makes her think she's better than her own husband?" The situation was spiraling out of control. Edward could feel the tension mounting as Mr. Martinez became increasingly agitated. His wild gestures and unpredictable movements made Edward increasingly concerned for Susan's safety. "I'm calling security," Edward announced firmly, reaching for his phone. This only enraged Mr. Martinez further. "Oh, sure. Call your fancy security. That's how you people handle everything, isn't it? Throw money at it. Push away the problems." He made another aggressive move forward, and Edward instinctively pushed him back, causing him to stumble on the steps. The action seemed to snap something in Mr. Martinez, and his face twisted with fury. "You don't understand," he roared, his voice echoing through the entrance hall. "That woman has been interfering in my marriage. She's turned Paula against me, made her think she's too good for her own home." Edward maintained his defensive stance, feeling Susan's presence behind him like a physical weight of responsibility. The evening he had so carefully planned had dissolved into chaos, and the revelations about Paula's situation were adding layers of complexity he hadn't anticipated. Edward took a deep breath, maintaining his protective stance but softening his tone. "Mr. Martinez, let's be clear about what you're saying. What exactly do you think is happening here?" "She's been filling Paula's head with nonsense." Mr. Martinez jabbed his finger toward Susan again, "telling her she deserves some fancy life like yours. Now Paula won't even come home." Susan's hands trembled slightly as she stepped forward. "Edward, I can explain." Edward turned to face his wife, his expression a mix of concern and confusion. "Susan, what is he talking about?" "Paula and I," Susan's voice wavered. "We've become friends. She needed someone to talk to, that's all. She's been going through some difficult times." Mr. Martinez let out a bitter laugh. "Difficult times? Our life was fine until she started spending time with your wife. Now suddenly everything I do is wrong." Edward raised his hand to quiet Mr. Martinez. "Susan, please continue." "Paula shared with me that there were problems at home," Susan said carefully, her eyes meeting Edward's. "She was scared, Edward. She needed support, someone to listen without judgment." "Problems?" Mr. Martinez's voice rose again. "What lies has she been telling you?" "They weren't lies," Susan replied firmly, though her voice shook slightly. "The bruises weren't lies. Her fear wasn't a lie." Edward's expression darkened as understanding dawned. He turned back to Mr. Martinez, his stance becoming more rigid. "Sir, I think you should leave now." "Not until I get my wife back." Mr. Martinez swayed on his feet. "You people think you're so much better than everyone else. Think you can just interfere in other people's marriages." "Nobody's interfering," Susan insisted. "I've only been trying to help a friend who needed support." Edward studied his wife's face, seeing the sincerity and concern in her eyes. The pieces were falling into place. The quiet conversations he'd witnessed, the emotional connection between Susan and Paula, the comfort they seemed to find in each other's company. It wasn't what he'd initially feared. It was something far more serious. "Mr. Martinez," Edward said firmly, "this isn't the time or way to handle this. You're drunk, and you're making accusations that clearly aren't true. I suggest you leave now, sober up, and if you want to discuss this further, we can do so when you're in a better state." Mr. Martinez's face contorted with rage. "You don't get to tell me what to do. This is between me and my wife." "No," Edward replied, his voice steel-edged. "The moment you came to my home and threatened my wife, you made it my business. Now I'm asking you one last time to leave voluntarily." Mr. Martinez glared at them both, his chest heaving with angry breaths. Susan stood her ground beside Edward, though he could feel her trembling slightly. "Let's all sit down," Edward suggested, making one final attempt at reason. "We can discuss this calmly and—" But before he could finish, Mr. Martinez spun around and stormed off into the night, leaving a trail of angry mutters in his wake. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily as Susan and Edward sat in their living room. The remnants of their interrupted dinner lay forgotten on the dining room table. Susan's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white with tension. "I need to tell you everything, Edward," Susan began, her voice soft but steady. "Paula first confided in me 3 months ago. I noticed bruises on her wrist when she was serving tea, and when I asked about them, she broke down crying." Edward leaned forward in his chair, his expression concerned. "What did she tell you?" "It started with small things," Susan continued. "Her husband would grab her arm too hard or push her against a wall when he was angry. But lately it's gotten much worse." She took a shaky breath. "Last week he threw a plate at her head. She ducked, but the pieces cut her shoulder." Edward's face darkened. "Why didn't she go to the police?" "She's scared, Edward. He's threatened to hurt her family back home if she ever reports him." Susan's eyes welled with tears. "Just yesterday, before you came home unexpectedly, she told me he'd threatened her with a knife. She was terrified, shaking like a leaf. That's what you saw. Me trying to comfort her." Understanding dawned on Edward's face as he remembered the scene he'd witnessed in the conservatory. "The hug I saw—" "Yes," Susan nodded. "She was telling me about the knife incident. I've been helping her research women's shelters and domestic violence support groups. We found one that might have space for her next week." She reached for her phone and showed Edward a list of shelters and legal resources she'd compiled. "I've also been putting aside some money from my allowance," Susan continued, "to help her with legal fees when she's ready to leave him. She needs a restraining order, Edward. The way he showed up here tonight, drunk and aggressive, that's exactly what she's been dealing with." Edward ran a hand through his hair, processing everything. "Has she documented the abuse? Photos, medical records?" "Yes, I convinced her to start keeping evidence." Susan pulled out a sealed envelope from a drawer. "She gave me copies for safekeeping, pictures of her injuries, threatening text messages, everything." The gravity of the situation settled over them both. Susan watched Edward anxiously, waiting for his response. Her shoulders remained tense, uncertain of how he would react to learning about her secret involvement in such a serious situation. Edward sat in silence for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the envelope containing Paula's evidence. The weight of his earlier assumptions and jealousy pressed heavily on his conscience. He looked at Susan, seeing her in a new light, not just as his wife, but as someone who had shown extraordinary compassion when he hadn't been paying attention. "I owe you an apology, Susan," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "When I saw you with Paula that day, I jumped to conclusions. I was jealous of your closeness, thinking the worst, instead of seeing what was really happening." Susan's expression softened. "What do you mean? What did you think was happening?" Edward's cheeks flushed with shame. "I came home early one day and saw you holding Paula, comforting her. I misinterpreted it completely. I thought—" He shook his head. "It doesn't matter what I thought. What matters is that you've been this amazing source of strength and support for someone in desperate need, and I've been too blind to see it." She had nowhere else to turn, Susan explained quietly. No one else she could trust. "You're remarkable," Edward said, reaching for her hand. "While I've been focused on business deals and profit margins, you've been literally helping save someone's life." He squeezed her fingers gently. "I want to help too. Whatever Paula needs, legal support, security, a safe place to stay. We can provide it all." Susan's eyes widened. "You mean that?" "Absolutely." Edward's voice was firm. "We have the resources to make sure she gets the best legal representation. We can hire security if needed, whatever it takes to keep her safe from that monster." "Thank you," Susan whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I've been so worried about her, trying to handle this alone." Edward moved to sit beside her on the sofa, drawing her close. "You're not alone anymore. We'll help her together." He held her tightly, feeling their connection strengthen with each passing moment. "I'm so proud of you, Susan. Your kindness, your strength. I've been taking these things for granted for far too long." Susan relaxed into his embrace, the tension finally leaving her shoulders. Together, they began discussing concrete plans to help Paula, their shared purpose bringing them closer than they'd been in years. The harsh ring of the doorbell cut through the evening quiet. Edward and Susan exchanged worried glances as they saw Paula's husband through the security camera, swaying slightly on his feet, but looking more desperate than angry now. "I'll handle this," Edward said firmly, placing a protective hand on Susan's shoulder. "Stay behind me." They opened the door to find Paula's husband, Mark, his earlier rage seemingly deflated into something more complicated, a mix of fear and confusion evident in his bloodshot eyes. "Please," he said, his voice hoarse. "I need to understand what's happening to my marriage." Edward studied the man carefully before making a decision. "Come in, Mark. Let's talk about this properly." He gestured toward the living room, maintaining a careful position between Mark and Susan. As they settled into the living room, Mark slumped into an armchair, running his hands through his disheveled hair. "I don't understand," he began, his voice cracking. "Everything was fine until Paula started spending time here. Now she's different, distant. What have you been telling her?" Susan leaned forward slightly. "We haven't been telling her anything, Mark. We've been listening." "Listening to what?" Mark's voice rose slightly before he caught himself, forcing his tone back down. What could she possibly have to say? Edward sat forward, his voice calm but firm. "Mark, sometimes people need someone to talk to. Someone outside their immediate situation who can offer a different perspective." "But why?" Mark's face contorted with confusion. "We've been married for 12 years. I provide everything she needs. I work hard. His voice trailed off as tears welled in his eyes. "Marriage isn't just about providing material things," Susan said gently. "It's about emotional support, understanding, respect." "You think I don't respect my wife?" Mark interrupted, but his tone was more defensive than aggressive now. "Everything I do for her. For us." Edward nodded thoughtfully. "We believe you care about Paula, Mark. Nobody's questioning that. But sometimes our ways of showing care can come across differently than we intend." Mark's shoulders sagged. "She used to smile more," he admitted quietly. "I don't know when that changed, or why." He looked up at Susan. "Is that what she talks to you about? Why she doesn't smile anymore?" Susan exchanged a careful look with Edward before responding. "Mark, Paula cares about your marriage, but she also needs to feel safe expressing her feelings and concerns." The word safe seemed to hit Mark like a physical blow. He sat in silence for several long moments, processing. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I never meant to make her feel unsafe." The morning sun cast long shadows across Edward's office as he sat at his desk, phone pressed to his ear. His trusted lawyer, James Mitchell, listened intently as Edward outlined Paula's situation, careful to include every relevant detail. "We need to move quickly, but carefully," James advised, his voice steady and professional. "Domestic abuse cases require immediate action, but we also need to ensure everything is done by the book." Edward jotted down notes as James explained the legal process, from restraining orders to divorce proceedings. "What's our first step?" he asked, his pen poised over the notepad. "Get her to a safe place first," James replied. "Then we can start the paperwork." After ending the call, Edward joined Susan in their car. They drove across town to Hope Haven, a women's shelter known for its comprehensive support services. The building was modest, but well-maintained, with security cameras visible at every entrance. Inside, they met with Sarah Chen, the shelter's coordinator. Her office was small but welcoming, with soft lighting and comfortable chairs. "We can take Paula in immediately," Sarah assured them, reviewing the intake forms. "We have secure facilities and 24-hour staff." "What kind of support systems do you have in place?" Susan asked, leaning forward in her chair. Sarah pulled out a brochure, pointing to different sections. "We provide counseling, job placement assistance, and legal advocacy. We also have support groups and childcare services." Edward cleared his throat. "I'd like to cover all expenses for Paula's stay and any additional services she might need." "That's very generous," Sarah said, making a note in her file. "We can arrange that through our administrative office." As they discussed the details, Edward brought up another matter. "I'd also like to fund counseling for Mark, Paula's husband. Is there a program you'd recommend?" Sarah nodded, pulling out another pamphlet. "We work with several certified counselors who specialize in anger management and domestic abuse rehabilitation. I can provide their contact information." They spent the next hour going through paperwork and procedures, ensuring everything was in order for Paula's arrival. Sarah explained the security protocols, including the confidential location policy and the screening process for visitors. "The most dangerous time for abuse victims is when they're leaving," Sarah explained. "We take every precaution to ensure their safety during this transition." Walking back to their car afterward, Edward and Susan felt the weight of what they'd set in motion. The morning sun had risen fully now, warming their faces as they crossed the parking lot. They had taken the first concrete steps toward helping Paula build a new life, free from fear and abuse. "Do you think we're doing enough?" Susan asked, pausing by the car door. Edward reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "We're doing what we can," he replied. "The shelter has the expertise to help her through this. We just need to make sure she has access to all the resources she needs." The living room felt unusually still after the chaos of Mark's outburst. Paula sat on the edge of the sofa, her hands trembling slightly as she held a cup of tea Susan had made. Edward and Susan flanked her on either side, creating a protective circle of support. "You're safe here," Susan said softly, placing a gentle hand on Paula's shoulder. "We won't let anything happen to you." Edward nodded, his expression serious but kind. "We've already spoken to a lawyer and visited the women's shelter this morning. They're ready to take you in whenever you feel ready." Paula's eyes welled with tears. "I never thought I'd have the courage to leave," she whispered, "or that anyone would help me like this." Susan reached for a notepad on the coffee table. "Let's go through what we need to do, step by step. It might help to have it all laid out clearly." Edward pulled out the papers from their earlier meeting. "The lawyer said we need your identification documents. Birth certificate, social security card, driver's license. Do you have access to those?" Paula nodded. "They're in a box under my side of the bed. I've been keeping important papers there, just in case." "Good thinking," Susan said, writing it down. "We should also gather any evidence of the abuse. Photographs, medical records, police reports if you have them." "I have some pictures on my phone," Paula admitted, "and there are hospital records from last year." Edward leaned forward. "The shelter has excellent security measures in place. There are cameras, secure entrances, and staff available around the clock. They also have counselors and support groups. And the lawyer is ready to file for both the restraining order and divorce papers first thing tomorrow morning," Susan added, continuing to make notes. "We can go with you if you'd like." Paula took a shaky breath. "I never imagined having this kind of support. I was so scared to tell anyone." "You don't have to face this alone anymore," Edward assured her. "We'll help you every step of the way." Susan reviewed their list. "We should probably get your documents tonight while Mark is away. Is there anything else you need from your house?" "Just some clothes and personal items," Paula said. "I've been keeping a small bag packed in the back of my closet." "That's very smart," Edward commented. "The shelter coordinator mentioned they have everything else you might need, toiletries, basic necessities, and we can always help if you need anything additional." Paula looked at them both, her eyes full of gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you both." "You don't need to thank us," Susan said firmly. "We just want you to be safe and have the chance to build a new life." The autumn sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Edward, Susan, and Paula made their weekly visit to meet with the legal team. Over the past few weeks, these meetings had become a regular part of their routine, each one bringing them closer to securing Paula's safety and freedom. Susan sat beside Paula in the lawyer's office, her hand ready to offer support whenever the discussions became particularly difficult. The lawyer spread out various documents across his mahogany desk, explaining each step of the process in clear, simple terms. "The restraining order has been processed," he explained, sliding the official document forward. "This means Mark legally cannot come within 500 feet of you, your workplace, or your temporary residence." Paula's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the paper. Susan noticed and gave her an encouraging smile. Edward, sitting on Paula's other side, leaned forward. "We've also arranged for a security system to be installed at the shelter's entrance, as an extra precaution." Between appointments, Susan accompanied Paula to her counseling sessions, waiting patiently in the outer office. She used this time to coordinate with the shelter staff, ensuring Paula had everything she needed for her fresh start. Edward had thrown himself into the practical aspects of helping Paula, channeling his business expertise into something meaningful. He set up a separate account to handle all the legal expenses and arranged for Paula to receive job training through one of his company's programs. "You're looking stronger every day," Susan commented one afternoon as they left the counselor's office. Paula did look different. Her shoulders were straighter, her steps more confident. "I feel stronger," Paula admitted. "I never thought I'd be brave enough to do this." The day the restraining order was officially approved marked a significant milestone. Standing in the courthouse, Paula clutched the document that legally protected her from Mark. Her eyes welled with tears, but this time they were tears of relief. "This is just the beginning," Edward assured her, his voice gentle. "You have a whole new life ahead of you." Susan noticed how different Edward seemed these days. His face had softened, and he carried himself with a new kind of purpose that went beyond business success. Helping Paula had changed something in both of them. As they descended the courthouse steps together, Paula turned to face them both. "I don't know what I would have done without you two," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've given me my life back." Susan hugged her tightly, feeling the profound impact of their involvement in Paula's journey. What had started as a simple friendship between an employer and employee had transformed into something much more meaningful, a mission that had given them all a new sense of purpose. Edward placed a supportive hand on Paula's shoulder. "We'll continue to be here for you, every step of the way." The autumn breeze rustled through the trees lining the courthouse square, carrying with it the promise of change and new beginnings. Together, they walked toward their cars, united in their shared purpose of helping Paula build her new life. The evening sun painted the garden in warm hues of orange and pink as Edward and Susan sat on their favorite wrought iron bench. The roses Susan had tenderly cared for all summer filled the air with their sweet fragrance, creating a peaceful atmosphere for their discussion. "You know," Edward said, his fingers intertwined with Susan's, "helping Paula has made me realize something important. We have the resources to make a real difference in people's lives." Susan turned to face him, noting the passionate gleam in his eyes. "What are you thinking?" "A foundation," Edward replied, pulling out his tablet to start sketching his ideas. "We could create an organization dedicated to helping victims of domestic abuse, something that provides the kind of comprehensive support Paula needed." Susan's eyes lit up. "We could offer legal assistance, like we did for Paula, and education programs to help women recognize the signs of abuse early on." Edward nodded enthusiastically, typing notes as Susan spoke. "What if we partnered with existing shelters, provide funding for better security systems, legal counsel, and counseling services?" "The foundation for new beginnings," Susan suggested softly. "That's what we could call it." Edward paused his typing, considering the name. "It's perfect. It captures exactly what we want to offer. A fresh start for those who need it most." They spent the next hour outlining their vision, with Edward applying his business acumen to structure the foundation's framework. "We should establish partnerships with local law firms," he suggested. "Create a network of professionals willing to offer pro bono services." "And support groups," Susan added, her experience with Paula informing her suggestions. "Sometimes just having someone who understands can make all the difference." As the sun continued its descent, They discussed potential partnerships with existing organizations. Edward made notes about reaching out to women's shelters across the city, while Susan suggested connecting with counseling centers and job training programs. "We should host a charity gala," Edward proposed, setting down his tablet. "Make it our inaugural event. It would be perfect for raising both awareness and initial funding." "We could invite community leaders, business contacts," Susan agreed, already envisioning the event. "Share Paula's story, with her permission, of course, to show the real impact this kind of support can have." The garden grew darker as they continued planning, but their enthusiasm only brightened. Edward pulled up his calendar to start blocking out dates for meetings with potential partners and advisors. Susan began listing people they knew who might be interested in supporting their cause. As the last rays of sunlight faded from the garden, they had filled several pages with notes and ideas. The foundation was taking shape, transforming from a concept into a concrete plan of action. Their shared purpose had energized them both, giving them a new direction that combined Edward's business expertise with Susan's compassionate nature. The grand ballroom at the Riverside Hotel sparkled with elegance as guests arrived for the Foundation for New Beginnings charity gala. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the carefully arranged tables, each decorated with centerpieces of white roses and soft candlelight. The room hummed with conversation as community leaders, business executives, and philanthropists mingled. Edward stood at the entrance with Susan, greeting each guest personally. He wore a classic black tuxedo, while Susan had chosen a deep blue evening gown that reflected her quiet confidence. They made an impressive pair, their renewed connection evident in their synchronized movements and shared smiles. "Thank you for coming," Edward said warmly to the city's mayor and his wife. "Your support means everything to our cause." As the ballroom filled, Edward took to the podium. His voice carried clearly across the hushed room. "Welcome, everyone. Tonight marks the beginning of something truly important." He paused, his eyes finding Susan's in the crowd. "Our foundation aims to provide comprehensive support to victims of domestic abuse, offering them the resources and courage to start anew." Susan joined him at the podium, sharing parts of Paula's story, with her permission, that highlighted the urgent need for their work. "Sometimes," she said, her voice steady and passionate, "all it takes is one person reaching out, one safe space, one moment of support to change a life forever." The silent auction tables lined one wall of the ballroom, displaying generous donations from the community. Local artists had contributed original paintings, while business leaders offered exclusive vacation packages and experiences. Guests moved between the displays, placing bids and discussing the items with enthusiasm. Throughout the evening, several survivors shared their stories, their courage touching hearts and opening wallets. The pledge cards at each table filled quickly as guests committed to supporting the foundation's mission. The city's police chief stood to announce a partnership program between the foundation and local law enforcement, focusing on improved response protocols for domestic abuse calls. The head of the local hospital network pledged support through their emergency departments and counseling services. As donation totals appeared on the large screen behind the podium, the room erupted in applause. The foundation's initial goal had been surpassed within the first 2 hours of the event. Susan concluded the evening with a heartfelt speech. "Tonight shows what we can achieve when we come together as a community," she said, her eyes scanning the room. "Every pledge, every partnership, every person in this room represents hope for someone seeking escape from abuse. Thank you for being part of this crucial mission." The applause that followed was thunderous, filled with genuine commitment to the cause. Guests began saying their goodbyes, many stopping to offer additional support or suggest further partnerships. The night had exceeded their expectations, not just in funds raised, but in the strength of community support shown. In the warmth of their home library, Edward and Susan settled into their favorite leather armchairs, the excitement of the gala's success still lingering in the air. The room's wood-paneled walls and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves created a cocoon of comfort around them. A gentle fire crackled in the fireplace, casting dancing shadows across the room. "I can hardly believe how much we raised tonight," Susan said, smoothing her evening gown as she relaxed into her chair. The familiar scent of old books and leather surrounded them, bringing a sense of peace after the bustling evening. Edward loosened his bow tie and smiled. "It's amazing what people will do when they understand the importance of a cause." He reached over and took Susan's hand. "But what amazes me more is how much we've both changed through all of this." Susan squeezed his hand gently. "Working with Paula, seeing her transform from someone so afraid to someone ready to build a new life, it's given me such purpose." Her eyes grew thoughtful. "And watching you step up to support not just her, but this whole foundation, it's brought us closer than ever." "I spent years thinking success meant bigger deals and better numbers," Edward admitted, shaking his head. "But seeing the real impact we can have on people's lives, working together with you on something meaningful, that's true success." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both reflecting on their journey. Susan's eyes brightened as she spoke again. "The shelter coordinator mentioned they're at capacity most weeks. Maybe we could look into funding additional facilities." Edward nodded enthusiastically. "We could start with neighboring counties, create a network of support." He paused, a warm smile crossing his face. "You know, I used to rush through every conversation, always thinking about the next meeting. Now I find myself wanting to stay in these moments, especially with you." "It's funny," Susan mused, "how helping others heal somehow helped heal us too." She reached for her tea, the delicate china cup warm in her hands. "I feel like we've found our way back to each other through this work." Together, they watched the sun begin its descent through the library windows, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. The peaceful moment wrapped around them like a comfortable blanket, a stark contrast to the glittering excitement of the gala, but equally precious in its own way. The beach glowed with the warm hues of sunset as Edward and Susan stood together on the soft sand. White chairs arranged in neat rows held their closest friends and family, while delicate white flowers and flowing fabric decorated the simple wooden arch before them. The gentle sound of waves provided a soothing backdrop to this intimate gathering. Susan wore a flowing cream-colored dress that caught the evening breeze, while Edward looked handsome in his light linen suit. Their hands remained clasped together as they faced each other, their eyes reflecting years of shared experiences, both challenging and joyful. "When we first married," Edward began his vows, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet beach, "I thought I knew what love meant. But standing here today, after everything we've been through, I understand it so much more deeply." He squeezed Susan's hands gently. "You've shown me that true success isn't measured in achievements or wealth, but in the lives we touch and the love we share." Susan's eyes glistened as she spoke her vows in return. "Edward, you've proven that people can grow and change when their hearts are open to love. Through our work with the foundation and our journey back to each other, you've shown me that second chances are possible when we're willing to be vulnerable and honest." Their officiant guided them through the sand ceremony, where they each poured different colored sand into a clear vessel, the grains mixing together in beautiful patterns. "Just as these grains of sand can never be separated," the officiant explained, "so too are your lives forever intertwined." Friends and family members stood to share their thoughts. Paula, sitting in the front row, spoke about how Edward and Susan's support had changed her life, and how their love story inspired hope in others. Other guests shared memories of the couple's early days, along with stories of their recent work in the community. The casual reception that followed filled the beach with joy. Fairy lights twinkled overhead as music played, and guests danced barefoot in the sand. Edward and Susan shared their first dance as a renewed couple to the same song they had danced to at their original wedding, though this time with deeper meaning and understanding between them. Laughter echoed across the beach as stories were shared over casual cocktails and a buffet of fresh seafood. Children ran playing in the shallow waves, their joy adding to the celebratory atmosphere. The whole scene reflected the lighter, more joyful life Edward and Susan had created together. As the evening progressed, they walked hand in hand along the water's edge, letting the warm water wash over their feet. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, while the first stars began to appear overhead. Their footprints in the wet sand marked their path together, each step forward a testament to their renewed commitment and shared purpose. Paula stepped onto the beach, her flowing turquoise dress catching the gentle breeze. Her face glowed with newfound confidence as she made her way through the reception, greeted by warm smiles and welcoming embraces from the guests. The shadows that had once haunted her eyes were gone, replaced by a spark of hope and strength. "Paula!" Susan called out, rushing over to embrace her friend. Edward followed, his face breaking into a genuine smile as he saw how far Paula had come from those difficult days just months ago. As guests gathered around, Paula found herself at the center of attention. Her voice steady and clear, she began to share her story. "A year ago, I couldn't imagine standing here like this," she said, looking around at the supportive faces. "Susan and Edward didn't just offer me help. They showed me what true friendship and support look like." She described how Susan's daily kindness had given her the courage to imagine a different life, and how Edward's practical support had made that new life possible. "Thanks to them, I found the strength to choose happiness," she continued, her voice thick with emotion. "They helped me see that I deserved better, and they stood by me every step of the way." Several guests wiped away tears as Paula spoke about her plans for the future. "Next month, I'm starting classes to become a counselor," she announced proudly. "I want to help other women find their way to freedom, just like I did." Throughout the evening, Paula moved among the guests, sharing laughs and stories. Many were touched by her resilience, and she found herself surrounded by people offering encouragement and support for her future endeavors. "Remember those first cups of tea we shared?" Susan reminisced as they stood together near the buffet. "Who would have thought they'd lead to all this?" Paula smiled, remembering those early conversations in the kitchen. "Those moments meant everything to me," she replied. "You listened when I needed someone most." Edward joined them, carrying glasses of champagne. "To new beginnings," he toasted, his eyes reflecting sincere appreciation for the journey they'd all shared. As the sun began to set, Paula walked toward the water's edge. The waves lapped gently at her feet as she gazed out at the horizon, painted in brilliant oranges and pinks. The sound of laughter and music from the reception carried on the breeze, reminding her of the caring community that now surrounded her. Standing there, feeling the warm sand between her toes, Paula felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The future stretched out before her like the endless ocean, full of possibilities and promise. The morning sun filtered through the large windows of the grateful being, casting warm light across the polished wooden countertops. Paula stood behind the counter, her hands expertly working the espresso machine as she served a steady stream of customers. The cafe hummed with conversation and the rich aroma of freshly ground coffee beans. The space reflected Paula's journey in subtle ways. Inspirational quotes decorated the walls in elegant frames, and a small corner display showcased information about local women's shelters. Cozy armchairs and intimate tables created an atmosphere that invited people to linger and connect. The bell above the door chimed as Edward and Susan entered. Paula's face lit up with genuine joy. "My favorite customers," she called out, already reaching for their usual orders. "This place gets more wonderful every time we visit," Susan said, taking in the bustling atmosphere. The cafe had become a neighborhood favorite in just a few short months. Paula brought over their drinks personally, a perfectly crafted cappuccino for Edward and Susan's favorite chamomile tea. She joined them at their table during her break, settling into a comfortable chair. "Business is better than I ever dreamed," Paula shared, her eyes bright with pride. "Last month we were able to donate 15% of our profits to the shelter. The community has been so supportive. People come in just because they've heard our story." Edward nodded approvingly. "You've created something special here, Paula. It's more than just a cafe." "That's right," Paula agreed. "Every week, we host support group meetings after hours. Women come together, share their stories, find strength in each other, just like I found strength in your friendship." Regular customers waved and smiled as they passed by their table. The cafe had become known not just for its excellent coffee and pastries, but for its warm, welcoming atmosphere. Paula had hired several women from the shelter's job training program, giving them a chance to rebuild their lives just as she had. "The best part," Paula continued, "is seeing how the cafe has become a safe space for so many people. Sometimes women come in just to talk. They know they'll find understanding here." As Edward and Susan prepared to leave, they looked around at what Paula had built, not just a successful business, but a haven of hope and healing for others. Paula hugged them both tightly, the gesture conveying her endless gratitude for their role in her journey. As they walked to their car, Edward and Susan felt moved by the profound impact of their support. What had started as simple acts of kindness had grown into something transformative, not just for Paula, but for the entire community. If you enjoyed the story of Edward, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.